Welcome to Make Art, a hands-on course for engineering design, a course taught at the University of South Florida. In this video, we'll have an introduction to Maya's basic tools, and we'll look at object mode. So over to the left side here, we have Maya's tool palette. You'll notice that the tools are made up of the selection tool, the lasso selection, paint selection, move or translate, rotate, scale, and then this area here is reserved for the last tool that you utilized. So since I utilized the sculpting tool, it's here. But if this was the first time I had opened Maya since my last session, you would not see anything here. It would be blank, and your previously used tool would appear here. This way you can easily get back and forth from the move tool to that previously used tool. But if you didn't use anything, again, this area would be blank. So in order to look at these tools and use them, we need to create an object or a mesh. So for this instance, we're going to go to Create, Poly Primitives. And you'll notice you have NURBS, polygons, volume primitives. You can create lights, cameras, curves, text, so forth and so on. But here we're going to look at polygon primitives. So we'll move over to the different primitives that you can create. And you can create spheres, cubes, cylinders, cones, planes, and so forth. Each one of these objects has a little box next to it. This little box is the option box that will allow you to set different parameters before you actually create the tool. But before we do that, let's look down at the bottom. We have two little checkboxes here. One is called Interactive Creation. I currently have mine turned off. Interactive Creation will allow you to interactively build the object from the ground up, meaning that if you're creating something like a cube, it will ask you where you want to create the cube, how big it is, and how high it is. Exit on completion will just automatically end on the completion of building that tool. So if I turn this interactive creation on by checking it and go back up to Create Poly Primitives Cube, it's asking me to drag out the base on the grid. So I just click with my left mouse button and drag, and then to drag out the height up or down, like so. This is well and good, however, it's created in an arbitrary area at kind of an arbitrary scale or size. If we look over to the right side in our channel box, we can see pcube1, meaning polycube, which is the name of this cube. We could click here and rename this, something like my cube. We'll also see over to the bottom of that, we have our translate or position in XYZ, and we'll notice that it's kind of arbitrary where I created it. It's just living in Maya's space in these values. So the default position of this cube is right here, which could be kind of hard to memorize these values. You'll notice that the orientation is all set to 0 because we haven't rotated it yet, and the scale is set to 1, which is also kind of strange since this cube is not 1 cubic centimeter unit. Remember that these grid spaces is 1 cubic centimeter or 1 centimeter. So this value is kind of weird as well. We'll look here in the inputs area of the polycube, and we'll notice that there's a width, height, and depth of the cube in centimeters. And we'll see that there are divisions. So how many divisions along the width, the height, and the depth were cut into the cube. And right now it's just one division to make the planes of the faces of each side of the cube. So let me select that cube again. So if I unclick somewhere out in the perspective window, remember if I have my selection arrow on, I can just click the cube again to get to its channels. So if I click it, I can hit delete on my keyboard and the cube goes away. So let's go back up to Create, Poly Primitives, Cube, but this time let's make sure we turn interactive creation off and go back to Poly Primitives, Cube. So now that I've created that cube, I can look here and I see that my position is all zeros because it's located in the middle of the grid. The rotate is also 0 and the scale is 111, meaning that this is 1 cubic centimeter. If I have this cube selected again, meaning that it's green, I have it clicked on, and I hit the F key, the letter F on my keyboard, it will frame that selection. So now I can see here that this cube is centered in the grid at 0, 0, 0. The reason why this cube is green when I select it indicates a couple things. One, that it's selected, obviously, but two, that I am in object mode, meaning that I can manipulate this entire cube as a whole object. So for instance, if I go to my Move tool in my toolbox or hit W, which is the shortcut key for the Move tool, I can see that I have my move arrows and my yellow move box, as well as some other move position icons or widgets. Now it's important to note that you want to make sure that you're moving in the proper axes. So if you look at your compass, XYZ, you can see that your Move tool is also color-coded for X red, Z is blue, and Y is green. So if I grab that arrow, I am just moving in that particular axis. You'll notice that Y is changing over to the right side. I can just click over here and type in 0 to put it back, which is why having this zeroed out as its default position is a good idea, because it's easy to remember the zeros. Same thing if I grab the Z value or the Z arrow, I'm just moving in that Z direction, and the X, I'm moving in the X direction. Remember that by default, Z is your front view. So we want to make sure that we're facing correctly, and again, moving with the arrows in that particular direction. If we move from the center, we're kind of arbitrarily moving it in X, Y, and Z all at the same time, which might be useful for some things, but typically it's not, because you get these weird kind of values. Again, we can just type all zeros in there by clicking in the box and dragging down to type in 0. And again, you can also just type in values. So if we want to move up 5 units, we can type 5. So now we're 5 centimeters up. So if we hit our space bar, if we have our mouse in the perspective view and tap our space bar, we can go to the front view or the side view, tap our space bar to enlarge that view, and we can see that we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5 units up. Now the reason why we're half units up is because our pivot point is in the center of the cube. So again, if we put this back at 0, we'll notice that the pivot point for the cube is right at 0, 0, 0. So I'm going to jump back into perspective mode and scroll in to view it. So let's switch over to something like rotate. If we have our rotate tool, we can see again our color coding. We have blue, which is rotating just in the Z axis. We have the red, which is rotating in the X axis. And then we have the green, which is the Y axis. And again, if we just kind of grab arbitrarily in the middle, we're rotating in all 3 axes at the same time. So you can see some of them are negative values and some of them are positive values. And the same thing with scale. So we can scale from the middle, which does everything in proportion, or we can do it by grabbing one of the boxes to scale in that direction. Now you also have these other little widgets or these planes that are also color-coded, and these allow you to scale in 2 axes at one time. So you can see I'm just doing the Y and the X, like so. And here I will be doing the X and the Z values. And that's the same thing with your Move tool. You could just move in those positions only, and it will not move in Z. Or it will move in anything but the Y axes with that. So the pivot point being in the middle might be good for certain types of things, but typically you may want to change it. So in order to change the pivot point, I'm going to jump into one of my orthographic views, preferably my front or side view. In this case, I'll go into my front view. And in order to change this pivot, I'll hit the Insert key on my keyboard, and then I'll just move that pivot point down. Make sure you use the arrow, so you're just moving the pivot point in one axis, and I'll put it at the bottom of the cube, and hit Insert to lock it back into place. Now that the pivot point is locked into place, I can adjust where my cube is. I may want to first just move the cube up to the grid line. So that would be 0.5 because it was in the middle, and now I moved it up to the ground plane or the 0, 0 axes from the front view, so that's 0.5. Now I know that I can move up 5.5 and it will actually be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units up. Now that might be well and good, however 5.5 is still not accurate because it's 5 units up, not 5.5 units up. So if I go back to my 0.5 and before I move it up 5 units, I can do what's called modify freeze transformation. Freezing transformation means that this new position will be its new 0, 0 location. So I go to modify, freeze transformations. What happens when I do that again is if we look over here in our channel box, now the y-axis is set to 0. So this is the new default location of 0, 0 at the bottom. So now all I have to do is hit 5 and it will have moved up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. And I'll jump back up into my perspective view. So again, one way to adjust your pivot point is by hitting insert. So now you'll see it's rotating from the bottom. It is also scaling from the bottom and moving from the bottom. So if we wanted this to be 5 centimeters tall, we would just have to type in, let's type in 5, there we go. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 centimeters tall, because I typed in 5 into the y-axis. So remember that's only in y. It's still 1 centimeter across x and z axes. So another thing we would want to look at here, let me put this back to 1 so we have our basic cube again. The other thing we want to look at is different view modes within Maya. Now if we hit our 4 key in Maya, so the number 4, we're looking at the wireframe. You'll notice that when I hit 4, it lit up this little box in the viewport here. So we can turn that box on and off and you'll see it's jumping back and forth from wireframe to shaded. So 4 is just the shortcut. 5 will be the shaded mode, so just the number 5 on your keyboard is shaded mode, the number 4 on your keyboard is wireframe mode. And that can come in handy when you're trying to get vertices and edges in the back of your cube. Other types of view modes, you'll have the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So 1 means that you're looking at your current geometry in its regular state, meaning how it actually looks. Hitting 2 on your keyboard will show the cage, meaning the way your geometry looks, along with the smoothed out version of the geometry, so a preview of if your geometry was smoothed out, along with the cage. And 3 mode will just show you a preview of what it would look like if you were to subdivide your cube. It would turn into a sphere, so adding more divisions and smoothing out would turn into a sphere. Remember, these are just preview modes, and the mode that you should be modeling in and looking at when you're manipulating your object is the 1 mode, or the low polygon mode, because the other ones are just previews that will show you if you subdivided your geometry even further. So I should also mention that if you want to reset your pivot point back to the center of your object, make sure you select your object, and then let me just hit W so we can see that our pivot point is still located at the bottom. So again, if we want to reset it to the center, with it selected, we would just go to Modify and down to Center Pivot. Now the pivot point will jump back to the center of our cube so that we can position and move and scale from the center of the cube instead of from the bottom of the cube. So we've utilized a couple of features or Maya menu functions. We've utilized freeze transformation to reset our position or rotate scale in the channel box to 001 value, making the default value the new position that we've placed our object, and we've utilized the center pivot feature. So if we want to utilize those over and over again, which you probably will, you might want to create shortcuts for them. So all you have to do is jump into your custom menu tab within your shelf bar up at the top, and this is where we can create our custom shortcuts. So let's first position our cube. We can even rotate our cube around. We can even scale it. So let's say this is the new position of our cube. This is where we always want the cube to be. So sometimes when you're working, you may want to move the cube out of the way or move your object out of the way, but always get it back to its default position or the position where you want it to be. And memorizing all of these values or writing them down could be quite tedious with a lot of different objects in your scene. So what we want to do is make this our new default position. So what we can do is select our object and go to Modify, Freeze Transformation. However, in this case, before we click Freeze Transformation, let's make our shortcut. So go to Modify, just put your mouse over Freeze Transformations, and then hold Control and the Shift key. So when I do Control, Shift, and I click on Freeze Transformations, it's going to put the Freeze Transformation icon in my custom shelf. Now I can click on Freeze Transformations with my object selected, and you'll see in my channel box that this cube, pCube1, now has zeros for translates and rotates and ones for scale, making this position its new 0, 1 location, or its new default position. So if I were to move my cube out of the way or re-rotate it, even scale it, and I wanted to get it back to that original position, I could just click and drag in my channel box the translates and rotates, put them to 0, and put my scales back to 1, and that is the position that I had it in originally. Another thing that we did was we used center pivot. So remember, when you hit the insert key, you can reposition the pivot point, but then hit insert to lock it in place, and then you can utilize it to change the position or rotate from that particular side or area of the object. If you want to get that pivot point back to the center, we would use Modify, Center Pivot. So in this case, we want to create a shortcut key. So again, we go to Modify, we put our mouse over Center Pivot, we hold the Control and Shift keys down, and we click Center Pivot. Now we have our Center Pivot icon in our option box, so all we have to do is click Center Pivot, and now the pivot jumps back to the center of our object. This comes in handy when you have grouping of objects in a hierarchy, and you just want to scale from a certain area and then reset the pivot of that group. So that's it for our introductory video on the Maya tools and object mode.